All right, let's talk tea. And I'm not talking about like spilling the tea because, man, I'm so cool. I know what that means. Kind of, not really. Anyway, we're going to talk about this Tea Act and then an ensuing thing called the Boston Tea Party, and then um, really the beginning of the American Revolution. And this is going to be taking place 3 years after the Boston Massacre. So what you've heard about today. So take a peek at this. It's 1773. The British passed this thing they call the Tea Act, and it was intended to help one specific company. And if you look over on the left hand side there, that is that's from Pirates of the Caribbean, and it's if you remember anything from there, it's the British East India Company. That's the group that keeps chasing the pirates. And what happened was um, they were struggling. They weren't making as much money. The tea prices um, rose because of this thing called the Townsend Acts, those taxes a long time ago. So the British said, okay, well, let's pause that. Let's do this tea act instead. So it actually takes away any tax on tea from the British East India Company, which they felt like was fine because you're British colonists. Everybody's British, so they should all want the British East India Company to do well. The colonists though were quite upset, even though the price, as you can see from that top, the price of the tea was dropping because they weren't having to pay the tax. They were mad because it gave the British East India Company, gave them like a monopoly, right? The colonial merchants were now cut out. Merchants were cut out of the tea trade. They didn't want to be told who they could and couldn't buy tea from. And many of the colonists looked at that British East India Company and said, like, man, like this is an example of the British Empire ruling and abusing their power. So they started to do a little bit more protesting and some more what we call boycotts. Across colonies, they protested the Tea Act. In Charleston, South Carolina, for example, British tea was left to rot on the docks. In Philly and New York, colonists refused to let British ships dock whatsoever, so they had to turn back and return to Britain. In Boston, though, you're going to see a group called the Sons of Liberty stage what was called the Boston Tea Party. We'll talk about that. Now, trouble had been brewing for some time. Right? We go all the way back to 1765 with the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Townsend Acts, Boston Massacre, right? And now we have this Tea Act where things are getting heated between the two groups, right? So what happens? Just a little tea, right? That's it. Um, on December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded three British ships in the Boston harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Funny, haha. However, if we adjust for inflation, that would be roughly 1.7 million United States dollars today. Right, that's a lot of money. British, for their part, in retaliation, they decided to pass a number of laws to punish the American colonists, and they called these laws the Intolerable Acts, or the British called them the Coercive Acts, and the Americans called them the Intolerable Acts. And really, it was simply they had been fed up for years. They would pass a law, the colonists would protest, they would repeal it, and then again, here they're going to decide it's time to punish these colonists. So 4 laws were passed to punish the colonists. And what they did, the first thing is they closed the Boston Harbor. They said you cannot go in and out. You can't trade along with Boston until you pay back the tea that you damaged or destroyed. They passed a new Quartering Act because new troops were going to be coming to Boston. It was a more intrusive Quartering Act, and many Bostonians were quite upset. They passed a law that said any British soldier or British official now, if they're put on trial, unlike Captain Thomas Preston, who went on trial in Boston, now they would be shipped back to England to go put on trial. And the Bostonians and American colonists were quite upset. And the last thing, they all but shut down the Massachusetts government. So here we have now 4 laws passed in retaliation for the Tea Act, which you're going to see will lead us directly to the first engagement of the American Revolution, starting with Lexington and Concord soon.